Hey everyone, Ben here. With the new official Formula 1 title now out, I wanted to give all of you sim racers who might be tempted to buy it a sense of whether I think you're likely to enjoy it, based on my playtime with the game so far. I'm going to try and steer clear of the same old conversation about whether it's a sim or not, and instead focus in on the specific things that I like about it and those that I don't. If you find it helpful, let me know by dropping the video a like, and if you want to see more sim racing content, get subscribed too. Let's get into it. So, first up, I really like the new handling and physics. It's not a massive departure from previous games, but with the change in regulations and the introduction of ground effect downforce, the cars do feel different. In particular, they're much tougher to handle in low speed corners, and can even break traction in mid speed corners too. I've been genuinely surprised by the extent to which I've had to adapt my driving style despite coming from racing much more serious sims week in, week out. And although I strongly suspect some setups and tracks need a bit of tweaking, for example poorer cars at Bahrain can feel excessively slidey, whereas if you take the same car to Australia, it's much less extreme. Overall, avoiding lighting up the rear tyres has been a very nice challenge to try and master. And believe me, it isn't easy. Running with no assists, I've had to drop the AI difficulty down by 20 points versus what I used to run in F1 2021 to be competitive with my teammate. The other really noticeable shift is the impact of curbs in the game. Not every curb is the same, with some being flat to the floor and easy to drive over, and other raised or sausage curbs being much more of a challenge. All of which is communicated well through the force feedback in my wheel. At one end of the scale, they're capable of unsettling the car and slowing you down. At the other end, they can seriously damage the floor and bodywork of your car, which is another really nice touch. From a sim racer's perspective, it means you have to really seek out the limits of the track, knowing that going a bit too far can have race-ending consequences. Conversely, the new simplified front wings means small bits of aero damage are no longer as serious as they were in F1 2021 and other previous titles, something which we've also seen play out in real life too. Finally, the elephant in the room: why don't these cars porpoise? If they're a proper simulation of real life, surely they should. Well, the fact that they don't could be due to limitations in the physics engine, or it could be a deliberate design choice. Honestly, I'm not sure I mind either way. Sooner or later, porpoising will be designed out of the real life cars, and the prospect of racing with a vibrating image on my screen for hours on end does not fill me with any great enthusiasm. It's one of those areas where personally I'm quite relaxed about the developers making a design trade-off for a more enjoyable experience. Of course, overall this is a somewhat simplified interpretation of an F1 22 car, designed to be driven by gamepad users and wheel users and by a range of skill levels. The cars do lack a bit of weight, and the track feeling does not match other sim titles. But even taking that into account, as a sim racer I've found it provides a believable, largely predictable and most importantly enjoyable experience, including across all weather conditions and tyre compounds, and that's no mean feat. Secondly, I really like the AI. Given the bulk of your time in F1 22 is likely to be spent offline, the AI is really important to the experience. Compared to all of the other sim titles I've played, F1 22 might just have the most believable and challenging AI of all of them. I'm not convinced they fully run on the same physics as the player, but it certainly looks as if they do to a degree. I've seen AI cars get unsettled on curbs, lose the car under traction, and understeer horribly with damage. None of it looks scripted, even if cars running side by side for corner after corner can look a little sketchy at times. The AI will challenge each other, often picking up damage and needing to pit for repairs, all of which adds to the feeling of authenticity in the race. Overall, the biggest difference this year is in the AI aggression. They aren't as much of a pushover in combat with the player and won't be as easily bullied off the racing line. With simulation damage on and flashbacks turned off, you have to be really careful with how you race against them, and much like racing online in other sims, caution is often advised. And I really like this. As a sim racer, I want my offline racing to be a considered affair where you have to pick your overtaking spots carefully. They're still a little bit pedestrian at the race start, and at many tracks you can dive bomb them into T1 to gain loads of positions. And I've seen a couple of questionable strategy calls too, with double stacking of cars in the pit lane. But overall, they're fun to race against and really add to the overall experience. Finally, the career mode remains best in class. Now, the extent to which you'll be interested in this as a sim racer will come down to personal preference, but outside of Forza and Gran Turismo, which other title allows you to develop a car, improve its handling characteristics and performance, and then see that translated into a different experience on track? Could it ever hope to be a perfect simulation of what it is to develop an F1 car? No, of course not, but then I'm not sure the PC has been built that could take that job on. The fact remains, whether you're developing your own team from the back of the grid or prefer the more focused driver career, no other racing game provides the depth and sophistication that F1 22 does in its career mode. I've often described one of my favourite things about sim racing as being enjoying immersive experiences and playing out fantasy scenarios that you otherwise couldn't possibly hope to do. Add in the excellent graphics, dramatically improved sounds and official presentation, and F1 22 provides those experiences in ways that other titles simply can't. So if those are the things I do like as a sim racer, what about those things that I don't? Well, first of all, I really dislike the headline new addition to the game, F1 Life. At its most benign, it's an entirely inconsequential distraction which presumably took up development time that could have been spent elsewhere. As a sim racer, it's entirely bizarre to me to be presented with new soft furnishing options as a reward for completing a race session, and at least at first you can't ignore it as it's the first thing the game presents you with. But actually, I don't think it is benign. I think it's a rather brazen attempt to get players, very likely younger players, to part with more money to kit their virtual avatar out in designer brands. Even if it is entirely optional, and even if items can be earned through in-game play, this sort of thing is exploitative, and for me it has no place in video games. In the interest of balance, let's be clear that other sim racing titles have pretty exploitative purchasing models too. I'm looking at you, iRacing, but one could at least argue that they're not marketed towards young people in the same way that this title is, nor is iRacing selling me light fittings for an imaginary house. Secondly, as I've already mentioned, I do wish there was more attention on multiplayer. There are a lot of options here and some nice ideas like the tracking of the real world season and reasonable customization options, but from what I've seen, the driving standards are still a bit like the Wild West, likely leaving league racing as your best bet for an enjoyable online experience. In terms of the driving itself, I'm not wild about the heads-up display when racing. The Race Engineer and Multi-Display both do a very nice job of providing you access to a range of quite complex information, but for me there are two fundamental things missing here which risk undermining the racing itself. The first is a radar and the second is a relative board. With more aggressive AI comes more risk of collisions. Because as a sim racer I prefer to run the cockpit camera, but like most people only have access to a single flat screen, my field of view is significantly impaired. Sure, you can turn on proximity arrows and I could map buttons to look left and right. In addition, a rear view mirror does appear to be in game, but for the life of me I can't work out how to make it appear. But the best solution to this would be to provide me with a radar which would help me see when cars are alongside and when I've got clearance on my inside or outside. And yes, you do have the race standings to give you a sense of the time differences between cars closest to you on track, but a relative board is more useful to you as a racer, providing information on where other cars are in relation to you regardless of whether they're fighting you for position or not. Finally, the experience of using the title on PC is pretty terrible. There's no mouse support, so menus are cumbersome if you don't have a gamepad. I've experienced a number of game crashes and getting my wheel and pedals to work and buttons mapped remains a pain. There still seems to be a button clash somewhere as to properly use some menus and the replay system I have to unplug my Fanatec rim. As a sim racer, these challenges are not new. Most sims can be maddening to set up, so these things aren't a deal breaker, but they can get very frustrating. As an aside, I don't have the kit required to test out the VR, but I've seen some pretty mixed experiences of it so far, including some who say it just doesn't work right now on their system. And there are also a range of supercars included in the game which I haven't even touched yet. That might sound odd, but honestly I'm just not interested in driving them in the official F1 title. Other dedicated sims exist for that. So overall then, will you enjoy this title as a sim racer? I think there is lots that can be enjoyed here, but ultimately it's going to come down to what trade-offs you're happy to make and what kind of experience you're ultimately after. This is a title explicitly designed for the mass market. I actually think in that context it does an admirable job of not just pandering to an arcade experience, but inevitably design choices have been made that take it away from being a thoroughbred sim racing title. Some of you will find that really unappealing, and in which case this title is unlikely to be for you. Likewise, if you're the kind of sim racer who likes to focus on online competition, I suspect this won't be the title for you either. But speaking as more of a generalist who hops between different sims and racing games, I think the handling, physics, force feedback, AI racing and offline experience are all good enough, and have so far provided me with lots of enjoyment. Let me know in the comments what you think, and if you want to know how I think the F122 cars stack up against those in AMS2 and Assetto Corsa, hit the link on screen now.